Danny's here already saying that, and I lost it. Got his coffee, Bible, ticket ready for tonight's episode. I guess that's what you call it, an episode. I sometimes feel like I'm having an episode as opposed to getting ready, or poor joke. Candy, you know what Candy does. Shake, lay down. Good voice tonight. Come on up, get in screen. Get where people can see you. Over top of the Bible. There we go. Have it open tonight to the book of Numbers, to chapter 6, verse 24. I wanted to reference the exact passage that I end all my videos with. Thank you for the 3 thumbs up, guys. Much appreciated. You know, the usual. You're welcome to subscribe. Anyone who's not, I think probably the 3 people here probably are already subscribed. If you want to, you're welcome to. If you don't, that's okay too. I have my coffee, have my Bible. I titled tonight's episode, to use Danny's word, evidence of absence does not necessarily mean absence of evidence. I mean, what does that mean? It's a phrase that has come up a lot during the COVID era. And Anne Monarchy is saying good evening all, and that this is one of the first chats he's been able to. Oh, come on. Why does this always do this? Live chat. One of the first chats I've been able to catch in some time. And Cryptomary is saying that that was Anna Monarchy who said that. Having trouble keeping up. Anna Monarchy doesn't have coffee, but a beer and herb and tobacco and a bong. Better a gram than a dam. That's a line from Aldous Huxley's old book, Brave New World. The drug was soma. Might as well have been weed, pot, marijuana, herb. Everyone's saying good evening to each other. I titled this Evidence of Absence Does Not Necessarily Mean Absence of Evidence. And it's a phrase that's come up a lot during the COVID era for those of us who have been skeptical of everything that's foisted upon us as quote unquote scientific fact. At the beginning of the pandemic, I've mentioned it many times, we were told that there was no evidence supporting an origin story outside of the official narrative that COVID came from a wet market jumping from a bat to a human. And because there was no evidence contradicting that narrative, they tried to present it as false. Even medical journals like The Lancet tried to suggest that anyone not going along with the official narrative was a tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist. And then later, mask wearing at first was not on the table, and they said that there was no evidence to support the idea that SARS-CoV-2 was an airborne aerosol transmitted virus. And then later that evidence came out. So typically what will happen in a lot of cases is that people will put forth a hypothesis, a narrative, a story, and if you don't believe it and you believe an alternative to the official, they will say, what evidence is there to support your contention, your belief, your opinion? And if you cannot provide smoking gun evidence, they'll say, well, it must be false because there's no evidence supporting your theory. I equate it to this. In the 1200s, someone standing on the west coast of England pointing out westward across the Atlantic Ocean says, I believe there's a large undiscovered a landmass that we have not discovered yet. And people might say, well, what's your evidence to support that opinion that you have? And if the person didn't have evidence, does that mean that the North American continent, South America, didn't exist? Did they not exist until the evidence was found, or did it exist beforehand? If SARS-CoV-2 was indeed created in a lab in Wuhan, China, maybe coordinating with other biolabs around the world, Did that only become true once the evidence came forth, or was it true beforehand? Of course, it was true beforehand. Um, and this is where this idea of evidence of absence does not necessarily equal absence of evidence. Doesn't mean the evidence isn't there. It just means you haven't found it yet. And right now, the context of this that brought it to mind was President Biden, Joe Biden, and others saying that this Jabbar character down in, I guess he's from Texas, who perpetrated this attack in New Orleans on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day, 3:15 in the morning, that he was acting alone, and there's no evidence to substantively link him to. They're saying he's a lone actor, and that, and likewise, they're saying that the other incident that happened at the Trump Tower in Las Vegas with a Tesla truck exploding, that there is no evidence of a link between the two events. And I'm not here to suggest that there is a link. And I'm not here to suggest that the guy, Jabbar down in Texas, I'm not suggesting that he was part of a coordinated attack, that he's not, I'm not saying he was not a lone actor, as the official version seems to claim. What I am saying is that I am suspicious when I hear the same narrative being promulgated by what I'll call the same usual suspects. When the same usual suspects are telling me this is what we want you to believe, no matter how plausible it is, I'm going to question. Danny's writing, something doesn't smell right. And that's exactly the headspace I'm in. Something doesn't smell right. Spidey sense tingling. I've got Sharunian writing, cannot trust the government. And the words are obsolete power. I'm wondering if you meant to write absolute power. That has become obsolete. We're living in interesting times, to quote the old Chinese proverb, curse. May you live in interesting times. And these times are interesting. There have been a number of news events that have hit within the last 24 hours or so. There's been a small plane crash into a business in California. I mentioned yesterday the incident in Montenegro, part of the old Yugoslavia, across the Adriatic, I guess, from Italy. I'd have to pull out my map. The Montenegro is part of the old Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, Croatia, all that. 10 people or so killed by a gunman in New York City. There was I think it's called Little Jamaica. There was a shooting, and I think it's 10 or so people shot and wounded. I don't think anyone died in that incident. And then out in Honolulu, they were celebrating the new year, and apparently fireworks tipped over and got into a house. 3 dead, 10 injured. Been a lot of a lot of tragic events have happened. Las Vegas, New Orleans, Montenegro, New York City, Honolulu, and there's probably more. There's likely many more that I'm missing. And Danny saying, amen, very interesting indeed, and will only get more interesting. That is what I have. My suggestion to anyone who's like-minded is, I don't want to say to put your head on swivel, but be vigilant, be aware, and be questioning, because it's been something of my thesis statement for a while now, probably a year or more, that we're reaching an inflection point where what I expect to happen is for populations in countries like Canada, the United States, and Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, the Western developed world, I'm expecting us to be hit with so many black swan events, one on top of another or simultaneously, that it will basically become system overload. And I mean, how do you cope for something like that? How do you cope for a situation that is, if indeed I'm right, and if it indeed would be by design, and everything's designed to overwhelm you? How do you cope with that? And of course, anyone who's watched the channel before should know that the number one coping mechanism, it's right in front of me. This is the Holy Bible. I'm going to read what's being written. I was actually drinking Montenegro wine over New Year's. Incidentally, doesn't seem so celebratory now, says Anna Monarchy. No kidding. There are so many events happening in the world right now. And because of the date of January 20th, because of January 20th, which is the inauguration date for Donald Trump for his new administration. That's when he takes the oath of office. I think there's another date, and I think it's maybe in 2 days. I think we're coming up to what they refer to as the certification vote in the, I guess, in the Congress. I'm not sure exactly how, they have the election in November, and then they have to have a meeting of this electoral college. Those votes have to be cast, but even then it's not done. Then that vote has to be certified. And then eventually Donald Trump has to be inaugurated, take the oath of office. And so there's a lot of steps to go through. And what's going to, is something planned for between now and then. And if indeed, and this is my speculation, if something indeed is planned, if you remember back on 9/11 and 7/7, 7/7 was the transit network attack that happened in London on July 7th. I think it was 2002. So you had the September 11th attack in 2001, New York. Everyone knows about that. The plane down in Pennsylvania, the two twin towers being crashed into and falling, and then the plane in Pennsylvania that left a big smoldering hole in the ground and no debris, no wreckage, no anything. And there's one narrative allowed. They wouldn't. The Bush administration pushed back about against even having an investigation into what happened. But while those events were taking place, there were exercises, simulations going on, mimicking exactly the same events that happened on 9/11. That kind of slows people's response. They don't know when you're involved in a military X. Everyone waits for the end X. When is the exercise over? And sometimes over the radio network, we would say exercise, exercise, exercise to stress that this is an exercise, not a real life event. On the 7/7 attacks, the July 7th attacks on the London transit network, what happened there was that there was likewise a consulting firm that was simulating the exact same scenario. I was watching a BBC interview with the gentleman who was in charge of preparing the London transit network for a terrorist-style attack. And as they interviewed him, he said, what's truly amazing is that while this was playing out, we were conducting a simulation of the exact same scenario that was taking place in real time. And so you have to go from scenario thinking to real-time response. And never suggested that, wow, you've got a simulation going on at the same time when an actual event that mirrors almost perfectly the simulation is happening. Things that make you go, and that happened likewise on 9/11. And what I have to wonder about with these recent attacks is there more planned, and who knows about it? That's the question I ask. Who knows about it? Are there players within, call it, use Donald Trump's term, the deep state? Are there players within the deep state who know that something like this is going to happen and they just want to diminish any heightened vigilance that is going on to allow anything that's planned in the future to have full effect, full impact. Welcome to the new year. Got a bit of a runny nose. Talk about compelling viewing on my YouTube channel. Watch Gordon Causey blow his nose. Let's see what was being written. There's a couple things here. Denny had written, I will be vigilant. Keep your head on a swivel. Situational awareness is paramount at this time and going forward. What's his name? Former President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, uttered that famous phrase, the only thing to fear is fear itself. And fear can become debilitating, incapacitating. People can become paralyzed with fear. And, when you talk about terrorist style events, that's part of the goal. Part of the goal is to terrorize. And I'm torn between, is this a genuine, this guy Jabbar from Texas, retired IT type guy in the US military who perpetrated this attack with the F-150. This is what is being reported. This is what we're being told. This is all we really have to go on. I certainly don't have the means to do any individual investigation into anything. I can listen to multiple sources and try and source things out, sort it out as best I can in my own mind, but I can't do any fully independent research into it. But apparently he had joined ISIS and was planning to get more involved with them. But the official version, what Biden is saying and echoing what the FBI is saying, is that this individual was acting alone. And there are so many question marks you have to ask. If you're someone who questions, you're going to have question marks here, there, and everywhere. When the United States saw that the Russians had invaded Afghanistan all the way back in 1989. The Russians invaded Afghanistan. And so the US was looking for, they didn't want the Russians to gain control over that central key piece of real estate, heavily rich in resources like lithium. You have oil in the Caspian oil basin. That's very close proximity. Afghanistan was a natural pipeline route. It's geographically important because it touches, I'm not sure I've got it 100% right, but basically it's almost like the hub of a wheel. China, Pakistan, Iran, all surrounding it, India, Turkmenistan. It's, as I say, it's like the hub of a wheel. And so the Americans did not want to see the Russians gain control over that key piece of real estate. And so they armed, financed, trained resistant groups within Afghanistan that eventually morphed into and became the Taliban. So the Taliban, at one time when the Russians were invading that country, the Taliban was a US ally. And then when the US invaded Afghanistan after 9/11, then the Taliban, former ally to get rid of the Russians, now they become the enemy. Your friends become your enemies become your friends. This is world politics. This is real politics, geopolitics. It's all power plays. And would the US try to use Islamic extremists groups like ISIS to achieve political ends, like they did with the Taliban in Afghanistan? Would they? And I think that's a very reasonable. I don't think it's unreasonable to think it's impossible. Could the US get into bed with these types of groups? We've seen many people who are anti-Israel will put forth the notion that the Israelis, that they created, that Hamas is a creation of Israel. And to a degree, that is 100% absolutely fair, because Israel certainly did build up Hamas, because back at its inception, when Hamas was born out of the old Muslim Brotherhood, the Israelis saw Hamas as a counterbalancing group to diminish the influence and control that Yasser Arafat's old PLO had. And it's that old axiom of a house divided against itself cannot stand. If we've got Palestinian Authority, PLO, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, if we have all these groups fighting against each other to be the predominant group in a place like, say, Gaza, if we can have all these groups fighting against each other, it diminishes their capacity to attack Israel. So there is some legitimacy to this idea that Israel, quote unquote, created Hamas. I don't go that far. I don't think they, quote unquote, created them. What I think they did is they built them up in an effort to destabilize, deunify in a fashion, the Palestinian and Arab population living in the Gaza Strip. I think it's better qualified as an Egyptian population as opposed to Arab, but whatever. It's just, we're coming up to an inflection point. There's so many spot fires burning all over the place, and it's just a question of at what point does something ignite in a major fashion. And January 20th is certainly a day that somewhat circled on my calendar. And as I was talking about yesterday, our own, Canada's little political drama that's playing out now with Prime Minister Selfie, our drama teacher, Prime Minister Trudeau. Why isn't he leaving? 16% in the polls. He's going to decimate the Liberal Party completely. What happened was, after Brian Mulroney resigned the leadership of the old Progressive Conservative Party, that was the party of Sir John A. Macdonald. They had been the Conservative Party back in 1867 when Canada started, and it was always called the Conservative Party. I'm not sure exactly when they changed the name, but it was just a name change. They changed it from the Conservative Party of Canada. They changed it to the Progressive Conservative Party. Something of an oxymoron. I'm a progressive conservative. I go forward and I go back. I go forward, I go back. So they changed the name, and they ruled intermittently. The Liberals have been the dominating political force in this country for good reason. It's because they positioned themselves in the middle between socialist left-wing parties and right-wing conservative parties. A frequent comment for years, going back to the 60s, is that the Liberals would campaign like the NDP or like the socialists, and then they would govern like the conservatives. And they, that was their modus operandi for ages. But the Conservative Party ruled intermittently. We had Sir John A. Macdonald, we had John Diefenbaker, and then we had Brian Mulroney came into power sometime 1984, 85, right around there. And he actually won 2 majority mandates. He won that first one, 84, 85. And then he won a second mandate that took him, I think it took us into the 90s. And it was during his second mandate that he realized, he saw the writing on the wall. He knew the party was going to be decimated because of the hated GST, the federal sales tax. So he resigned, handed the leadership off to Kim Campbell. And Kim Campbell led the Conservative Party the old Progressive Conservative Party into their biggest electoral defeat in history. They only got 2 seats. One was Jean Charest in Quebec, and another one was out west. That was it. That was what was left of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, the successor to the old simply Conservative Party of Canada. And what happened is, on the political spectrum in Canada, the right wing, I'm trying to think of the right word here, the insurgent Reform Party stormed onto the scene, and they actually formed the official opposition at some point, with Preston Manning leading them. And then Joe Clark, who had been a previous prime minister and a previous leader of the progressive conservatives. He came along and he took the leadership back, resurrected progressive conservative fortunes to a degree, made them a viable political force, but now they had no chance of winning government because the West was dominated by the Reform Party, which later changed its name to the Canadian Alliance. But the Reform Canadian Alliance couldn't win seats in Eastern Canada from Ontario East, and the Progressive Conservatives couldn't win seats anywhere west of Ontario. All of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, that was all Reform territory. And it forced the old Progressive Conservative Party and this new Conservative Party, the Reform Canadian Alliance Party, to merge. It forced them to come together because they realized separated they're never going to defeat the Liberals. Jean Chrétien won 3 minority mandates in a row against a divided right. And the expression was unite the right. We need to unite the right. Otherwise, it's going to be liberal government after liberal government forever. So they united the right. What's going to happen now in this coming election, if we indeed have one? And I think that's an open question. If we have an election, the Liberals could be conceivably completely wiped out, not get any seats. Most projections, you go to 338.com, and they have the Liberals winning 6 or 7 seats. That's they lose official party status at that point. They're not officially recognized as a party in Parliament. They don't get money. There's financial resources that an official party gets that the Liberals wouldn't get if they only had 6, 7 seats. During an opposition day, when the opposition gets to control the agenda and put forth motions like motions of no confidence, well, Liberals would be shut out of that if they don't have official party status. And I think what you could see happening is a merging of the left. You could see the Liberals and NDP joining together, and we could get into a situation basically like they have in Great Britain or in the United States. Great Britain, it's Labour and the Conservatives. US, it's Democrat and Republican. In Canada, we could end up with a party merged between the Liberal and NDP against the Conservatives. But Pierre Poilievre is poised to win 250, if not more, seats in a parliament that will have, in the upcoming parliament, 343. They're adding 5 new seats. Let me see what's being written. There's a few things. We got a number of people here. Danny's writing, the Democrats cannot let him in. $64,000 question. How will they do it? It's a common refrain right now. Is something going to happen? A week is a lifetime in politics, and we're 18 days away, or 2+ weeks away from Trump taking the oath of office. Will something happen? Can we end up with Kamala Harris? Who knows? We'll see what happens. And Danny's likewise writing, they, in quotes, are everywhere. The plan must move forward. And then he says, Lee Harvey Oswald worked alone too. Ha 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 ha. Yeah, that's the official version. That's what the Warren Commission said, is that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman and that he had a magic physics-defying bullet that was able to go in multiple different directions, change directions. And I think most people in the world now recognize, well, I'm not exactly sure how, but I'm convinced that JFK was taken out for a number of different reasons. He had cheesed off organized labor, and organized labor in the United States, groups like the Teamsters had ties to organized crime. And Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, younger brother and Attorney General, was going after the mafia tooth and nail. So, and then there was the fact that Kennedy spiked what was called Operation Northwoods. And if you don't know about that, look into it. It was a plan put forward by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon to have an inside job committing acts of terrorism in the United States, sinking ships, crashing planes into buildings, and then to blame it on the Cubans in order to gain support for a war of invasion to retake Cuba. And the Kennedy administration spiked it. They mothballed it. No, we're not going ahead with that. So I think there were a lot of reasons why they wanted Kennedy gone. I also think the industrial military complex had a hand in it. He wouldn't commit to the war in Vietnam the way that Lyndon B. Johnson did. Lots of reasons. Hank Holliday's here saying hello to everyone. Anna Monarchy writes then, as is likely familiar to a lot of us here, another president said the 9 scariest words in the English language are, well, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Haven't done my Reagan impression for a while. Well, liked Reagan. Just his homespun humor and everything was amazing. Now, Hank's writing, Sleepy Joe gave them all the weapons when we left Afghanistan. Yeah, they basically, when they walked out of Afghanistan, they abandoned their weaponry. And a lot of it fell into the hands of the Taliban and whatever groups could get their hands on it. How many came across the borders? Oh, and I don't think Canada is completely safe either. No, we're far from, in the Islamic world. Often the United States is referred to as the big Satan. Canada is Satan's little brother in their, call it cosmology, ideology, religious worldview. The United States is the big Satan. Canada is the little Satan. I do think we're going to see, as we move forward to January 20th, I feel somewhat inoculated, somewhat, because I live in a small rural area. And so I think if I'm right and if things do go down, I always predicate this with if. I'm no prophet. I'm not an oracle. I don't have a magic 8-ball or crystal ball. I don't know what's coming. I just have my suspicions that there is going to be significant events happening, like what was just seen in New Orleans and, especially New Orleans and to a lesser degree in Las Vegas. And I almost get the impression that the reason they're trying to paint everyone go back to normal, everything's fine, everything's normal, nothing to worry about here. I go back to the COVID era and think about the fact that initially in January and February, I have a very generalistic thesis statement about how I think things went down in the COVID era that I'm somewhat reticent to put out there simply because YouTube, but maybe I can, talk between the lines enough that I can get it out there. I mean, basically, there are viruses that exist that are severe, like Ebola or I don't know, Ebola would be one. Whatever, there are viruses that have a high degree of lethality, and then there are much more mild viruses, like say chicken pox, these so-called childhood diseases that everyone used to get before they came up with jabs to inoculate us against them. But so there's severe viruses and where did COVID fall into that spectrum? When cases first started to come out, it struck me that they wanted us to all think it was bubonic plague, the Black Death, and that, you were almost 90% certain to be, getting hooked up to a ventilator in an ICU unit if you caught this thing. They wanted to, I think, Fauci at the beginning said that it was at least 10 times more deadly than the seasonal flu. That was the messaging right at the start. Now, I think it's been fairly well established that SARS-CoV-2 never approached that level of lethality for the general population. For 99% of us, it wasn't 10 times more deadly than the flu. Don't quote me on that, though. Simply being safe. But at any rate, at the beginning, there seemed to be very little effort in play to try and mitigate SARS-CoV-2 from getting a firm hold in the human population. Donald Trump I think it was in February when he restricted travel coming from China and maybe Italy. He started to restrict travel into the United States before things blew up, before they instituted lockdowns and all the other mandates. And Trump was called a racist for it. And I have to question, was the desire to simply ensure that SARS-CoV-2, that the virus itself got a firm foothold in populations all around the world. Theresa Tam in Canada, likewise, she was on record saying that they didn't want to institute any type of travel bans or travel restrictions for people coming in because that would stigmatize people. That would be racist. And, if we were to restrict travel from Italy or from China, that this would stigmatize significant Canadian populations, and we don't want to do that, blah, blah, blah. And my open question is, was that simply a desire to ensure that SARS-CoV-2 got as firm a foothold so that lots of PCR tests would ring up positive, and then any death for any reason? Toronto Public Health admitted in a public tweet on what is now X, they said that any death that occurs with a positive COVID test is added into the COVID death numbers, even if COVID didn't cause the death. And we all saw this. There, guys died of fentanyl overdose, COVID death. Kid in Tallahassee, Florida, crashed his motorcycle, died. He had a positive test, so COVID death. There was a murder-suicide in Colorado. Now you can read mainstream and ABC, NBC, CBS. It was ABC or CBS, I forget which, but had a report on a murder-suicide that had taken place in rural, small town Colorado. And the coroner was complaining about having to include both the murderer and his victim as COVID with the COVID death numbers because they had positive tests on record. And she was saying, this coroner, a woman, she was saying that it skews the numbers. We're a small population. It makes it look like COVID is a huge problem here. But this wasn't COVID deaths. But they were counted with the COVID numbers. And that was standard operating procedure as directed by World Health and the CDC. Anyone who dies with COVID has to be counted in the COVID death numbers. And, if the virus had not been able to gain a firm foothold in the population, then you wouldn't have the numbers. Because in Canada, 300,000 people in 2020, roughly 300,000 people were expected to die anyway. And how many people died in 2020? I think it was 305,000, like only a little bit higher. Again, he's talking about how, right, left, conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat. He says two wings of the same bird. And Hank Holiday is writing about how dollars got beaucoup de cash for every positive case. That is true. I read that again, mainstream. It was ABC or CBS News reported a Minnesota state legislator was saying that within his state that every positive COVID test resulted in the healthcare provider, the hospital or whatever, getting in and around $10,000. He said that it depended on the jurisdiction. Some areas would have higher costs and would get more money. So I imagine somewhere in New York City, they would get more than Baton Rouge, Louisiana. But for Minnesota, it was around $9,000 for every positive COVID case. And it was up around $30,000 for every patient who was put onto a ventilator. Ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. And it's a well-established fact that there's billions of dollars of fraud in the US medical system because it's profit-driven, and a lot of that money flows from the federal government. People don't think that there is public health care in the United States, and that's not true. There is. They have Medicare, and Medicare is for every citizen over the age of 65, has similar to a Canadian type healthcare system. And there are all kinds of stories about they'll take the patients in a nursing home and or Alzheimer's dementia wing, and they'll put them into a room and show them a movie and call that cognitive therapy and things of that nature, and then bill it to Medicare ka-ching, 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 roll the money in. So if they would do that, if they would take patients suffering from dementia, have them watch some stupid movie, call it cognitive therapy, if they would do something as mind-blowing as that, is it inconceivable to think that they would gerrymander the results of tests to ensure that they get their 10 grand, and would that influence a caregiver's decision on as to whether or not to ventilate a patient? Because if you do put them on a ventilator, that's another 30 grand, ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. And once a patient goes onto a ventilator, everything I've read, everything I've seen, everything I've heard is that you put a patient onto a ventilator and their chances of them surviving that, because they have to go into an induced coma and it's incredibly invasive, and the survival rate is very low. There's a lot of money at stake. Follow the money. Yeah, everyone talks about follow the science. It's said by many people smarter than me. Don't follow the science, follow the money. The money will tell you where the science is going to point. And when it came to the COVID, you got money for positive tests. I mean, I haven't talked about the PCR tests here much, and how they have what is called the cycle threshold. And it's kind of like when if you're looking at a picture and you're trying to determine, is that guy holding a gun? And you can't really tell. And then you make it bigger and bigger and bigger. But as you make the picture bigger and bigger, it pixelates and becomes blurred. And then you're looking, and the guy has something in his hand. Is it a gun? Well, it's so pixelated, you can't tell, but it could be, it's possible. And that's similar in a fashion to this cycle threshold. They look for the SARS-CoV-2 virus at amplification cycle 10. Well, we didn't find it. 11. No. 12. No. 13. No. And they keep going up and up and up. And back all the way in September or August of 2020, there was an article in the New York Times saying your COVID test is positive. Maybe it shouldn't be, quoting experts from the Howard Chen School of Public Medicine at Harvard, not Tijuana Medical School, Harvard Medical School, Howard Chen School of Public Health. And they said up to 90% of the tests that were coming back positive could be negative because the amplification thresholds were too high. There was a disconnect in the article, as I recall when I read it. Some of the staff at this Harvard Medical School, some thought that the amplification cycle should stop at 30. Some said they would push it as high as 35, but that was their limit, 35. Some thought 30. And there were amplification cycles taking place in Ontario. You could check it out on the Ministry of Health's website, and they were going as high as 40. And what these experts with Harvard were saying is that when you amplify too high, you could be looking at residual RNA from an infection that cleared weeks or months ago. So the person has no active live virus, just dead viral RNA. Or it could be something like another coronavirus. Common cold is a coronavirus because the amplification cycle has been ramped up too high. But that's an easy way to boost the COVID numbers. And then likewise, anyone dying, Toronto Public Health, and this wasn't just Toronto, it was the United States. This was World Health Organization direction, that anyone who died with a positive test would have to be counted with the COVID numbers. So when we get hit with these people who say, well, look at how many people died. 8,000 people died in Ontario, or whatever the number is. I never paid too much attention to that number, because a death with COVID is not necessarily a death from COVID. How many people died as a direct result of COVID? We don't know, because anyone with a positive test, well, it's like what happened to that kid out in Alberta, a tragic child who had stage 4 terminal inoperable brain cancer. And they tried to count his death as a COVID death because it added to the numbers and it sells the fear. But getting back, in order for that to happen, in order for all these positive tests to come in, they needed SARS-CoV-2 to get a firm foothold in the population. And so any measures that were being brought in, like by President Trump and back in 2020 when he was trying to prevent people coming from China into the United States. He was called a racist. The Australians and New Zealanders did the same thing, and they were applauded for it. Was there an effort to ensure that SARS-CoV-2 got as firm a foothold in the human population as possible? I'm not answering the question. I'm just putting it out there. I have my opinion on it. You can figure that out yourself. And then likewise, now I equate it with the situation we're reviewing with Las Vegas and New Orleans, and goodness knows, maybe some of these others, maybe they have a tie-in or maybe they don't, but and everyone's saying, well, just relax. It's a lone individual. This is not part of a criminal conspiracy. This individual, this Jabbar guy, was acting alone. We have no indications that there was any connection, any concrete connection. No evidence that there's a connection between the guy in Las Vegas and the guy in New Orleans. So these are isolated incidents. Just relax. Go about your day-to-day life. Just, treat everything as normal. And this is getting back to what Danny said. I don't want to say head on a swivel. I don't want, to a degree, it can become like something like water torture. You're just constantly looking, and then you'll start to see things that aren't there. Let me see what's being written. Live chat seems to be working a bit better. Danny writes, the words that have seemed to have resulted in me having, what's the population on this planet? 8+ billion. And then the question is that just sustainable? And I'm trying to talk around it. Might there be something put into place, or might things be done to try and ameliorate that situation? Danny's talking about Dr. Kerry Mullins, who created the PCR test. Yeah, he said that the PCR test was not to be used in of itself as a diagnostic tool, that it could be part of a diagnosis, but not alone. It wasn't to be used alone for diagnosis. Like if diagnosing diseases can be difficult. You have a number of diseases being presented, and it might present is it RSV? Is it flu? Is it COVID? Is it MERS? Is it SARS? What is it? We don't know. And so one of the tools, might be urinalysis, might be blood work, and you could add into that PCR test, but not just the PCR test, is what Kerry Mullins, the creator of the PCR, polymer chain reaction test, said. Anna Markey writes, ventilators put too much pressure on the lungs and damage the elasticity, and ventilator patients were put on the drug. I've always had trouble pronouncing that drug, remdesivir or whatever it is, that has severe renal complications. And I remember back when the Lancet, the widely held, everyone says the Lancet is the supreme medical journal in the world. And they went and they published an article that was written by a company called Surgisphere that proved, quote unquote, that ivermectin was not only ineffective against COVID, but that it was in fact dangerous. And as soon as that article, and this came out just around the time that Joe Rogan had famously said he'd been taking ivermectin under the direction of a doctor, along with zinc and a couple other medications, a little cocktail, and that he'd recovered very quickly and very strongly, everything back to normal within a week or so after a very severe bad case of, I guess, what would have been the Delta variant, when COVID was apparently very, it could knock you on your ass like a really bad flu, which I've had a couple times in my life. There's a couple times in my life I've had the flu where I thought I was gonna die. It was bad. Both ends, to use some rather graphic, gross, disgusting illustrations, and sweating, and just to get up to go to the bathroom is like a major ordeal. I've had a couple of bouts like that of the flu. The flu can wipe the crap out of you. And I gather that when this was somewhat what Joe Rogan went through when he was diagnosed with COVID, his doctor prescribed ivermectin and this little cocktail of drugs. He took them and recovered very quickly, back to 100%. And then there seemed to be a concerted effort to demonize ivermectin. And the Lancet then published a study, again by a company called Surgisphere, that trashed ivermectin's not only ineffective, but actually dangerous to be given to COVID patients. And then even research into ivermectin stopped. Well, it's proven now. We've got the evidence. It's dangerous. It's ineffective. And what was later found out, and it was actually The Guardian that I think broke the story, the company Surgisphere was headed by a doctor who had 2 or 3 ongoing malpractice lawsuits that had been launched against him. The data that they'd used to support their conclusions in the study were found to be 100% fraudulent. They were using fraudulent data. And this company, Surgisphere, only had 3 people on their corporate roster. One was this doctor who was facing multiple malpractice suits. Another one was a science fiction writer. And the last one was an exotic dancer. And somehow this company, with headed by a doctor facing malpractice suits, a science fiction writer, and a stripper, gets their paper published to the most prestigious medical journal in the world. If that doesn't make you go, then nothing will. And you can't trust anything that's out there anymore. And now they're saying to us, well, there's no connection. This guy in New Orleans was acting alone. Just relax. Go to the Cotton Bowl. Go to the Super Bowl. Don't be hypervigilant. There's no need. We've got it under control. We'll keep you safe. We'll keep you safe. I'm to go back to Ronald Reagan's comment. We're from the government and we're here to help. I'm going to wrap up and I'll just read what's being the last few. And Hank is saying about Gates's comment that the next one, the next disease, the next outbreak, the next disease X, whatever it is, that it will get our attention. Danny writes that ivermectin costs pennies, hence the problem. I have my own opinion on that. If any intervention, whether it be ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, or anything else, had been found to be an effective treatment for COVID, then that would preclude the ability of regulators to assign an emergency use designation to any other type of intervention. The only way you can get an emergency use authorization for anything is if all other available options don't work. Whether they be cheap generics or otherwise. Everyone on this station, 99% of you know what is going on, know what the ultimate agenda is. It's a simple fact of the matter. I can state this as fact. There are over 8 billion people on this planet. If you want to know what the ultimate agenda is, that's what you got to look at first. There are 8 billion people on the planet. And is that a problem? Not in my opinion. I think we can have 8 billion more. But in certain quarters, that would be a very unpopular opinion if for someone to suggest that, hey, 8 billion, let's double that. Let's go to 16 billion. It's not a matter of population. It's a matter of the way population is distributed. Humanity likes to, we're herded into large population centers. Mexico City, New York City, Shanghai. Tens of millions of people living on top of each other. That's the issue. Humanity, we are designed to live in community, absolutely. But when these hyper mega cities are a problem. Let me read. Yeah, Eat Me's writing, horse paste, they claim. Seems ivermectin also does wonders on cancers in general. It just might be the ultimate cancer cure. I can't speak to that. I have no idea. I'm just going to read on. Eat Me saying amen et bonsoir. Danny is saying at Eat Me. Eat Me's writing, hope RFK will launch mass testing of ivermectin on cancers. Who knows, he might. Eat Me wrote to Danny, bonsoir, came in late, was watching the Peterson interview with Polyev. I watched that as well. I watched, it's a very soft interview. Polyev is talking to the converted. Peterson did push him on a few things. Now, how are you going to do that? He wouldn't allow Polyev to just use big grandiose statements without putting him under a bit of academic scrutiny. Well, what exactly does that mean? How exactly are you going to achieve that? But at the same time, I don't think he pushed Polyev too hard. And anyway, are we going to get to an election? I didn't watch the entire interview, but I probably watched 3/4 of it. It's about 90 minutes long. And I probably watched about 45, 50 minutes of it, maybe an hour at most. So I saw most of the interview. And Polyev is very polished, very down to earth. It's a great format. But I love how the way they frame it and say that this will give, Peterson would say this will give Canadians a chance to get to know Pierre Polyev in a relaxed podcast style format, unscripted, blah, 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 blah. And I wonder to what degree is that 100% true? My videos, yes, I'm 100%. I think it's obvious my videos are 100% unscripted and no teleprompter, no anything. And I don't edit anything. And I think that comes across. You can tell when someone's edited something because they're here and then all of a sudden they're over here and you don't see the hands move, that kind of thing. But I know with Peterson and his affiliation with the Daily Wire and the production values that he's able to bring in, who's to say that there isn't some that he talked about having driven over. I was talking to you about that as we were driving over here to do the podcast. And so how much of it was just genuine conversation and how much of it was scripted or planned out ahead of time? These are reasonable questions to ask. I have my misgivings about Polyev. And I also, even if everything he says is 100% on the money, the big question is if he implements the types of, severely wants to restrict the size of government and wants to push the lobbyists away and the consulting firms away. There's a lot of money in big government. There are a lot of industries that rely on government spending tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars and spreading it around. And if he comes in and tries to radically, they talked about this a bit in the interview, is about how does the government continue to finance all this? Well, they just keep printing more money. That's part of it. They just tax and print more money. Printing money adds to inflationary pressure. Well, if he stops doing that, there are a lot of vested interests who have a stake in the status quo. They're going to want things to stay the way they are. And Peterson talked to Polyev about the pressure, or they both talked about the pressure that comes to bear on a prime minister who now vaults onto the world stage with all these world players and then wants approbation from their globalist audience. And they want to be seen by this globalist crowd as doing the proper job. Does Polyev have the, I want to use a polite word, cojones? Does he have the wherewithal to stand up to the type of pressure that will come to bear if he seriously tries to undermine the existing status quo? Because if he tries to tear it all down, the way that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and Trump are talking about doing with this DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, things could get freaky. So I should watch the end of that interview. Danny's writing, doctors were let go for successful use, blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah. What happened to doctors? The most heinous example, and I would invite you guys, check this guy out. His name is Dr. Francis Christian. and he was, past tense of the verb, a teaching surgeon with the University of Saskatchewan. And he had the unmitigated gall to simply question whether or not, to question the efficacy of having children get you know what, and to express doubts on it. And they removed his teaching privileges at the University of Saskatchewan, and they took away his license to practice medicine. It was heinous what happened to him, and he's an incredibly bright individual. He actually was co-editor of a medical journal himself, and when they sacked him, they ganged up on him. There were 3 individuals on a conference call that he was asked to jump onto. He was told they needed to have a conference call, and it was with the dean of the school of the University of Saskatchewan, the head of his own department, and then I believe the Minister of Health for the province of Saskatchewan, and they ganged up on him. And the Minister of Health, the government official, she kept saying, "Now, Francis, you're sounding very unstable. I'm a little worried about you." And it was all, and that really genuinely scared me. Listen, the Canadian Center for Constitutional Freedoms, I think is the name of the group that stepped in to help him fight against this. I don't think they were successful ultimately, but on their website, when Francis Christian was on this call, he was smart enough, he recorded it, and it was the recording was available on their website. Dr. Francis Christian, he writes a Substack. I invite you, I've never met him, don't know him. I've met a number of, I've done a podcast with Robert Malone. I had a brief conversation with Maxime Bernier, and went down to Aylmer and met a few. I met Salim Mansour, a writer with the Sun Media Corporation. I met a few people who were pushing back against this insanity that we had to live through. And I just think, COVID was one aspect. I think we may get hit with so many different things at the same time that our ability to process it is going to, even for those of us, if you're afraid to go out, if you're afraid to gather in large numbers because of terrorist style attacks, because of what happened down in New Orleans, is that a virus is one thing, but a guy barreling down the road with an F-150 pickup truck and hitting anyone he can get in his sights, that's something else. Let me just read the last few. Amy saying it was really good talking about that interview with Polyev and Peterson. Yeah, it is very good. Danny's mentioning a Dr. Charles Hoff. I'm not familiar with that name right off the bat. Now, Amy is writing that Polyev said that he will axe the carbon tax on day one, or else he feels he will lose all trust from his voters. So at least we have that to go on. It's a foregone conclusion that provided everything goes the way it's supposed to, and that we do in fact have an election, and the sooner the better. But the reason I'm hesitant, the reason I'm somewhat pulling back and questioning the potential that could something happen, is because by any reasonable measure, Trudeau should have walked away. He should have resigned. There should be a leadership convention race going on with the Liberal Party right now, but there's not. Trudeau talked about during his year-end interview with Michael Critch on This Hour Has 22 Minutes. He said that when his dad, Pierre Trudeau, was his age now, that his dad still had 12 more years as prime minister. Trudeau seemed to be Trudeau's not going. As things stand right now, Trudeau has made it patently clear that he's not leaving. There's nothing in his rhetoric suggesting that he is getting ready to leave or is even considering it. We could be stuck with him, until, and Jagmeet Singh, and that's one thing I wish they would do. Peterson and Polyev both in their interview, in their talk, refer to Jagmeet Singh as Jagmeet. And the man's name is pronounced Jagmeet. You don't have to like an individual to respect them enough to pronounce their name in the proper way, the way it is supposed to be pronounced. You know, Polyev, Polyev, maybe you have some trouble pronouncing that because your facility with French isn't that great. So you say Polyevra, whatever. But Jagmeet. It is spelled Jagmeet, but it is pronounced, according to the man himself, the proper pronunciation is Jagmeet. And I think it's simply a matter of basic human decency and respect to pronounce the man's name the way he wants it to be pronounced. Doesn't mean you have to agree with anything he has to say. You can completely think he's a moron idiot, that he's bent on the destruction of Canada and the entire Western world, whatever. At least call him by the that's all I'm going to say on that. But they both kept saying Jagmeet. Danny gave me a word instead of, when I say reach down and check and see if you have a pair, cojones and like that. Danny talks about testicular fortitude as a good substitute. I like that. I'm going to borrow that. I've heard it before, but it didn't come immediately to mind. Very good. And Danny's writing that Trudeau is a tyrannical dictator. Well, back in 2015, before he became prime minister, when he was campaigning in Montreal in front of a women's group, he was asked if there are any countries in the world he admired. And he said, I have to admit to a certain degree of admiration or respect for China because of their basic dictatorship and how it allows them to get things done very quickly and, without. Lovely. Canada, that should be a flag for everyone. If you ever hear a politician talking about speaking admirably about brutal dictatorships, that should be a warning sign. And guilty as charged in 2015, I voted Liberal. I admit it. I'm not proud of it, but I own it. I messed up. About 3% of Canadian voters in that election, 2015, messed up. The vast majority of us, like myself, have realized our mistake. In 2019, 2021, I actually voted PPC. This time, 2025, barring something momentous, I will be voting Conservative. Philip Lawrence, the guy in my riding. Looks like there's one last comment. Hence why I'm Chinata. That's what it's become. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I didn't get too much into scripture today. A little bit. I think I mentioned my faith a bit, but not much. Yeah, I did. I said, we're going to navigate this world. Don't look for answers anywhere but from the one who created all things. And I always, at the end of my videos, I quote a blessing that comes from the book of Numbers, but I don't quote it 100% accurately. So I wanted to, it's Numbers chapter 7, verse 24. If you go to verse 22, the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron and his sons, thus you shall bless the people of Israel. You shall say to them, this is the blessing for Israel, and Israel means, Israel means one who struggles with God is the actual meaning of the name. Jacob wrestled with an angel of God all night, and the blessing he received was, your name Jacob, you are now Israel, and Israel means one who wrestles with God. But it also means, Israel means is God's covenant chosen people. And those who have accepted Jesus Christ into their heart, we are grafted onto that vine. We are part of God's chosen covenant people. So the covenant promises made to Israel, we are included, having been grafted on to that cultivated, chosen vine. And this is the blessing that is for us. And the blessing is this: the Lord bless and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So I ask you to receive those words. I always say it as, may the Lord bless and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you, and may the Lord grant you peace. That's the way I've heard it often in church from the pastor at the closing to the service. Ryan, one of the pastors I know, he'd say, receive these words. And when I'm in church, I just spread out my hands as a physical representation of the condition of my heart. Bring it. God's blessings. Who doesn't need God's blessings? Who? Who? Who let the dogs out? Who? 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 Oh, anyway, I hope everyone does well. I hope 2025, I hope I'm wrong about everything. But I wanted to be wrong about the imposition of a vaccine passport. I wanted to be wrong about war coming to some part of the world back in March of 2023. That was I made 3 predictions. Sadly, the one that came true was that there would be an explosion of war someplace. And that happened. And now a lot of fires out there. But anyway, again, may the Lord bless and keep you. And we'll see you all in a few days, tomorrow, whenever. Anyway, God bless. See what the last few are. Be strong, good courage, and monarchy. My friend in high school with a Vietnamese background, internet gaming name was. Oh, okay. All right. I caught up on the message. We'll talk to you all soon. Night all. Okay.